You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the European semester.
Achieving Europe's 2020 targets of sustainable growth is a team effort that will require the coordination of member states' budgetary and economic plans.
To lead this fiscal and economic choreography, the EU has set up the European semester, a key element in the EU's economic governance. But let's decipher the jargon and explain more. Stay with us.
In late 2009, with more and more Eurozone countries unable to refinance their government debts or to bail out over-indebted banks, the EU set to work on resolving the root causes of this crisis.
So next to the emergency support mechanisms, long-term measures and tightened surveillance systems to prevent future crises were also set in motion. One of them is the European semester.
It aims to detect, prevent and correct dangerous economic trends such as excessive government deficits or public debt levels that would put a country or the whole euro area into trouble again. So how does it work?
It seems complex, but it is fairly straightforward. The European semester is essentially a yearly cycle of economic policy coordination. It ensures that member states discuss their budgetary and economic plans with their EU partners at specific times throughout the year. This allows them to comment on each other's plans and enables the European Commission to step in before decisions are made at national level. But let's take it step by step.
Well, the first step is the Commission's annual growth survey, which is published every year in November and establishes the general economic priorities for the EU, providing member states with policy guidance for the upcoming year.
The Commission also publishes the Alert Mechanism report, which identifies member states at risk of potential macroeconomic imbalances. If deemed necessary, the Commission can issue so-called in-depth reviews for individual member states.
Around February-March, the European Parliament and EU ministers discussed this annual growth survey, taking into account the views of national parliaments. And in April, member states submit their plans for sound public finances, the so-called Stability Convergence Programmes, and for smart, sustainable and inclusive growth, the so-called National Reform Programmes.
These national reports clarify steps and measures on how member states intend to achieve the overarching policy goals of Europe 2020 for smart, sustainable and inclusive growth.
These plans are assessed by the Commission in May, and together with the annual growth survey priorities, they allow the Commission to provide specific recommendations for each country for the next 12 to 18 months.
In July, the European Council endorses these country-specific recommendations, closing the annual cycle of the European semester at EU level. So what's the role of the European Parliament in this whole cycle?
Well, there are two important moments for the European Parliament. In late autumn, it expresses its opinion on the ongoing cycle, and in February, on the annual growth survey and the Alert Mechanism report. To broaden the February debates since 2012, the European Parliament also organises an inter-parliamentary meeting on the European semester cycle. The event is part of the so-called European Parliamentary Week.
In addition, MEPs hold several economic dialogues with other EU institutions and representatives from member states subject to country-specific recommendations. So now that we've explained the timeline, let's look at the outcome of the 2015 cycle.
Well, except for Greece and Cyprus, which were undergoing economic adjustment programs, the 2015 country-specific recommendations addressed all other member states and focused on four key areas: boosting investment, structural reforms in product, service and labour markets, fiscal responsibility and improving employment policy.
The Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee of the European Parliament welcomed this focus, but feared that economic recovery may be threatened by the EU's underlying structural weaknesses and regional differences, and noted a generally poor implementation record of the country-specific recommendations.
The committee's report took note of the European Commission's efforts to streamline the European semester process, for example, through focusing on a few key priorities, and a call for more ambition in implementing socially sustainable structural reforms.
MEPs urged for a better alignment of country-specific recommendations with the excessive deficit procedure, the so-called corrective arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. They also welcomed the Five Presidents' report's roadmap towards a more integrated European semester and recognised the increasing interdependence among euro area member states.
The Commission proposal for a revamped European semester seeks to better integrate the euro area and national dimensions and address spillover effects. To this end, in 2015, country reports were published for the first time in February, 3 months before the country-specific recommendations were finalised.
The idea is that in the future, discussions about the euro area take place first so that common challenges can be fully reflected in country-specific actions.
But revamping the European semester also means reinforcing the social dimension, increasing the focus on economic convergence, and strengthening the dialogue between national stakeholders and the European Parliament at key moments of the semester.
The European Commission also wants member states to improve implementation of country-specific recommendations. How? Well, in two main ways. Through the increased use of benchmarking and cross-examination exercises, and through the introduction of macroeconomic conditionality. But what does this mean exactly?
Well, essentially, it means linking the European structural and investment funds expenditures in EU member states to the key priorities highlighted in the country-specific recommendations and making funds conditional to a country's respect of these priorities.
This measure raised eyebrows in the European Parliament, which managed to ensure that funds would only be suspended as a last resort measure and always taking into account the social and economic situation of the country concerned.
So now that we know how it works, let's turn to the current economic semester cycle.
The current cycle kicked off in November 2015 with the launch of the Annual Growth Survey, the Alert Mechanism Report, the Draft Joint Employment Report, and the Commission's recommendations on the economic policy in the euro area as a whole. Let's see this in more detail.
Well, the Annual Growth Survey establishes three clear priorities: relaunching investment, pursuing structural reforms to modernise our economies, and engaging in responsible fiscal policies.
And there's also a to-do list for the euro area as a whole, pursuing policies that support economic recovery and foster convergence, and implementing the necessary reforms for a sound job market with social protection mechanisms, amongst other measures.
This year, and despite the Council's concerns, the Alert Mechanism report adds for the first time 3 employment indicators to the purely economic indicators used until now. These are the activity rate, long-term unemployment, and youth unemployment.
In 2016, in-depth reviews will be prepared for a total of 18 countries, the same as in 2015, plus Estonia and Austria, which join the list of EU countries at risk of imbalances.
And one mixed result for the 2016 Draft Joint Employment Report: while the employment and social situation is slowly improving, not all member states are doing equally well.
All of these reports have already been examined by member states in the Council, and Portuguese MEP Maria João Rodrigues will submit an own initiative report on the 2016 priorities to the Brussels plenary on February the 24th.
The new European semester cycle is gathering momentum, so stay in the loop. You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.